Where David started off giving you the big picture this morning, I'm going to give you a bit more on the detailed front. And I'm going to stand here because I've got lots of pictures for you to look at as we go through. But we're going to focus on, I'm going to leave this first slide up for a bit. So, as David mentioned, apart from possibly France, which had a different relationship with Africa to the rest of the imperial powers, it doesn't appear that when war broke out in Europe, that Africa was actually meant to be included in this conflagration. Both the British and the German governments sent messages to their African territories announcing that war appeared imminent, but that no action was to be taken at that time. However, when war was declared, they didn't send any messages out to Africa to tell them what they had to do. There was just too much happening in Europe. So each territory therefore responded according to its own circumstances, influenced by the attitude of the local civil and military administrators and those local inhabitants who had a grudge to get back at across the border. The war in Africa, as we heard, was subsidiary to what was happening in Europe. For years, the campaigns in Africa have been regarded as a sideshow, insignificant to warrant detailed research or study. However, as those of us with African roots and interests know, the reality was very different, and the impact on World War I on the continent can still be seen today, despite what some people might think. These days, we tend to be very judgmental in looking at the past. But I don't think that is very helpful in this situation. We can't change the views, the values that we have today compared to what they were in the days gone by. But by understanding why things happened in the context in which they happened, we as Africans and others can focus on the positives and the strengths that came out of the 1914-18 conflict and build a better world. One that our ancestors on all continents fought to achieve. Today, I want to explore through case studies how primary source research, getting into those archives, very clean archives here in Britain, very dirty and dusty ones in Africa and elsewhere, is rapidly changing the way we need to think about the war in Africa. My published work has focused mainly on white imperial or colonial involvement in the war in East, Central and Southern Africa. Not surprisingly, given my heritage and the fact that my historical interest is the interplay between individuals and bureaucracy. In the same way that David was talking about the difficulty of getting articles into the broader domain, my work on Sikhs and Muslims and other diverse communities is hidden away in specialist journals which the public don't generally get to see and that are coming out. Understanding the big picture allows for the details to be put into the wider context. I have also, until recently, which is about 3 years ago, firmly held the opinion that I couldn't write the history of other cultures because, as a South African, I've only got 2 of the 11 official languages. I cannot access the material of the other 8 groups. My position, however, has changed over these years as I have realized and become aware of how few African historians, as opposed to Africanists, are working on the topic of World War I in Africa. And the exclusion here has to be West Africa, where there is a huge body of academics and others who are working on the First World War in Africa. I'm yet to find them in my own country, South Africa, as well as East Africa, Kenya and Tanzania. This in itself is an interesting area of study, but not one for today, though. It does indicate and reflect the political developments and relationships with the Western or colonial powers. My approach now is to bring the hidden or undiscovered histories to light, in the hope that we will encourage African scholars across the continent and here to engage and take up the challenge of investigating their culture's involvement in World War I. Concerning East Africa, this will result in at least 177 versions of what happened in that campaign alone. as the number of micronations that I have identified as being involved in that campaign totals 177. Alas, I know we will not get 177 different accounts, mainly because most of those groups had an oral tradition and their records no longer survive. Many of those involved, well, all of those involved now have died. But that should not stop us from striving to tell their stories. So what this means for me is that I only use the word African when it refers to all or the majority of the micronations involved who were settled in Africa, black tribes, Indian, Arab, and white settlers who were either born in Africa or who regarded the continent as home. So before we now get on to two case studies that I want to look at, being supplies and race relations, I want to give us a brief overview of the war in Africa. Britain entered the war on the 4th of August 1914. The first shot was fired in West Africa, as we heard, on the 7th of August, the second on the 8th of August in East Africa. On the 15th of August 1914, German forces entered and occupied the only British territory of the war, that of Taveta in today's Kenya. And they were to hold that until mid-February 1916. The first German territory to fall during the war was Togoland on the 25th of August 1914. The next, German Southwest Africa or Namibia on the 9th of July 1915, and Cameroon on the 18th of February 1916. Men who served in West Africa were also to serve in East Africa from mid-1916 onwards, when most, but not all, of the white troops were withdrawn, ostensibly for reasons of health, although politics played a very important role in that too. The German forces in German East Africa, or what is today Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi, fought their last battle on the 13th of November 1918, 2 days after the armistice in Europe, and officially surrendered on the 25th of November 1918 in Zambia. The forces used were diverse, and here might be an answer to a question raised earlier. The forces used were diverse, and although we can get fairly accurate numbers of the fighting men, the total number directly involved in the war is still unconfirmed. We have estimations. Each imperial power had its own approach to record keeping. Different departments were involved in the process across different countries. Men served on both sides. So we have German or British King's African Rifles serving with the Germans as Askari, and then later on moving back to serve with the King's African Rifles. How do we account for them? We don't know. And records have been destroyed for various reasons, including archives burning down in Kenya in 1925 and being bombed in London in the 1940s during World War II. And we know that those included most of the southern African records of the war. The terrain and the conditions the men and women served in were harsh. Africa, as we know, is unforgiving and undiscerning. It either floods or, more invariably, is sweltering with heat. Seldom is there an in-between. The years of the First World War saw some of the heaviest rains on record, as well as some of the most severe droughts, not helped by the scorched earth policy, which was implemented late in 1917 in East Africa. It is estimated that 75% were lost due to malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition. Gunshot and other war wounds accounted for less than 10%. In addition to the weather, roads were scarce, and the railways only in the northern part of German East Africa and from Mombasa to Uganda in Kenya. At that time, wild animals still roamed much of the area, and tales are told of lions and others taking soldiers out of their tents, crocodiles feasting as people crossed rivers, and hippos turning over boats. In addition to the big animals, snakes, and other crawly creatures, there was one of the most feared, being the jigger flea. And in this case, the white Africans had to rely, or white soldiers had to rely very definitely on their black counterparts to remove these awful creatures from their toes. They were the only ones who could do it without causing further medical problems. Long distances and poor infrastructure meant that most transport had to literally be manpower. In places, horses and oxen could be used, but these often fell foul of tsetse fly or sleeping sickness. Despite attempts to keep men of the same faiths and cultures together to ease dietary provisions, this did not work due to the nature of the campaign, and there are records of men being on as little as quarter rations for a few days at a time. Weather and circumstances of war meant that where food was available, it couldn't be properly prepared. Maize meal, otherwise known as pap, putu, fufu, or ugali, all the same depending on where you come from, requires thorough cooking over a fire with water. Water wasn't always available, and often fires could not be lit in order to prevent discovery by the enemy. Men therefore ate raw or partially cooked maize meal with the resultant consequences. Although there are some accounts of animals being shot for the pot, this was often banned because of the sound of gunshot would travel and alert the enemy. Days would pass by monotonously. In the South West Africa campaign, copy of the map there, which in its intensity lasted only about 6 months, only 19 days of actual fighting are recorded. The rest was moving men and equipment into place. Similarly, in East Africa, marches were long, with short, sharp skirmishes taking place. The suspense of not knowing what was around the next rock, over the mountain, or behind that 6-foot grass was more stressful than the thought of being shot. And we have letters of men wanting to go to the Western Front where a sniper bullet would catch them instead. Few of any colour had had training for their roles, so it is not surprising that often when a shot was heard, local loads would be dropped and men would disappear. Case study number 1, supplies. And this is the reason or the cause of me being here today, and the inspiration for the title of this talk. Christine and I met at the end of last year over a discussion at the National Archives about the shoes for carriers. The common perception is that Britain didn't care for its African, black in this instance, carriers, as they did not supply them with shoes. Perhaps, but here are some other factors to consider. White soldiers, both British and African, in rags. One account by a doctor tells of a colleague too fearful of washing his uniform following an instruction by a superior officer. It was eventually decided that the doctor should wash his shirt first and see how that fared. The result was he maintained his dignity in what was remaining of his shorts. He eventually got a makeshift shirt constructed from bandages and other available scraps of material made by one of his Indian stretcher bearers, until the contingent was eventually sent back to Dar es Salaam for re-equipping. This incident happened in 1917, when the chaos and rush of going to war was no longer an issue. Seen alongside the carriers not being supplied with shoes, a different scenario starts to emerge. Africa was not an important theatre compared to those which would have a direct impact on the status and survival of the European colonial powers. When shipping and the availability of supplies allowed, these were sent to Africa. That Britain had a hierarchy of who received preferential treatment in terms of supplies can be found in correspondence both in South Africa and West Africa in 1914. In 1914, the 4-year young Union government was needing equipment in order to participate in the war. The equipment it had on the outbreak of war was mostly returned to England when the imperial garrison was released for service back here. Jan Smuts, the Minister for War, scrounged the empire for arms, eventually sourcing 2 cannons from Malta. The men to man them came from St. Helena, leaving that outpost with no defence, and the rifles came from the Portuguese, who were then neutral. No one else had any to spare. Similarly, a note in correspondence concerning materials for West Africa, which we've got here, refers to getting equipment to Canada, which was sending men to the Western Front. If Canadians couldn't get the equipment, how could Africa expect to get shoes or anything else? The pecking order was defined. Britain, Dominion sending troops to Europe, African dominions, and then colonies. East Africa was supplied by India, a long-standing military arrangement. However, India too was reliant on Britain for sourcing much of its military equipment. The sudden increase in demand for material meant hard decisions to safeguard the core had to be made. Africa, being on the periphery, had to wait. Further evidence of this can be found in the Admiralty correspondence, where the Cape Squadron leader set out all he had to juggle when asked to convey troops from Cape Town to Southwest Africa. This is not to say there was no discrimination in dealing with local groups. There was. But rather than broad brush this as racist, which I tend to hear today, I think it requires further unpicking. Discrimination, though, is discrimination. However, it is important to look at the underlying reasons. At the time of the First World War, there was a generally accepted racial hierarchy based on knowledge to date. Black Africans were generally seen as less intelligent, slow to learn, and backward, as one of the documents state. However, ideas were being challenged by men such as Lord Bryce and Gertrude Bell, and locally men and women who had been educated in mission station schools were seen as more acceptable as they were educated in Western ways. There were big political debates going on around this topic, but at a practical, more local level, colonial office officials generally, I think, tried to do what they thought was best for the people they were responsible for when they felt that the indigenous populations were being unfairly treated. They replaced officials, including governors such as Sir Percy Girard in Kenya in 1912, for giving Maasai restricted land to settlers, including to Lord Kitchener. Their actions had to be balanced with doing what was best for Britain, the country concerned, within budgets which had to be kept as low as possible. Returning to our topic of shoes, local military officers were also concerned about their men, as noted by the officer in charge of the Gambia contingent, for a sergeant to be paid for the cobbling duties he'd undertaken in addition to his soldiering duties. This correspondence shows how local conditions were adapted to ensure imperial budgets were kept low, but also that men received recognition for what they did. Another point to consider on this front is that the provision of shoes could actually have been more detrimental and caused more trouble than what they were worth. And this is particularly the case for people not used to wearing shoes. I remember as a little girl spending most of my time barefoot, even in the town. In the villages I frequent today in Africa, children and teenagers are often barefoot, and if people are wearing shoes, they tend to be what we call flip-flops. In the late 1800s, it was still a matter of pride for the Zulu people or the Zulu army to go barefoot, showing their toughness. It was easier to sneak up on the enemy. All of a sudden, to go into shoes, blisters, chafing, and other pains would have to be dealt with. Photos of labour recruited locally show women and men going about barefoot. It was the norm for many. However, shoes or no shoes, jiggers, rain, and long marches took their toll on all. By the time they got to leave Lol Kasali in 1917 in East Africa, a Dr. Douglas noted he was left with 200 foot cases to deal with, of all races. Colour played a role, but it was not the main determinant. As demonstrated with supplies, it was far more complex. Aspects such as class, social standing, wealth and education, and religion played a part. Officers were a world apart from their men in the traditional army structure. When General Horace Smith-Dorrien was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the East African Forces, he asked for an increased entertainment allowance in late 1915, as he understood Nairobi was more expensive than the Western Front. This partly explains why South African General Jan Smuts was liked by many of the men, but not the officers, who served under him. Smuts went into the field and suffered in the same way that his men did, as far as an officer could. Similarly, when Commander Geoffrey Spicer Samson took the Lake Tanganyika expedition through Cape Town on their way to Lake Tanganyika, they were housed in different locations. Spicer was at the Mount Nelson, his officers at the Grand Hotel in Adderley Street, and the men at the Seamen's Mission in the docks. South Africa is often criticised for not arming black soldiers during the war because of apartheid policies. Apartheid started in 1948. But that is not to say that there were not aspects of that policy around before then. There was a huge concern or fear of black uprisings, which we know as the Black Fear or the Swart Gevaar. And this led to white farmers who had revolted against the government being allowed to retain some arms. However, South Africa's military policies were in keeping with those of the time and of the British Empire. Research into Jamaican involvement in the war by Robert Smith of Goldsmiths University provides the evidence for Britain's reluctance to arm troops who were not white, and how circumstances forced the military to change its position. Lord Kitchener often found himself in the minority and on the receiving end of attack, as he valued and encouraged the use of local forces. He had also been against the war being fought in Africa, but was outmanoeuvred on this front. Most of the colonial powers avoided arming blacks if they could. It is estimated that on the outbreak of war, 60% of the German Askari were Muslim, suggesting the majority were of Arab or Somali descent, the coastal areas being the main source of recruits. The Portuguese police forces were predominantly Indian, again suggesting a preference of men who were not black. It's also worth noting that at this time, Goans were recorded separately to Indians on returns showing racial breakdowns. Where micronations were found to be trustworthy and fulfilled the requirements of the martial race theory, which was dominant at the time, they were recruited and used to fight against other black micronations, the idea being that black lives were more expendable. As mentioned earlier, there was a political undercurrent to this move. Politicians in Europe and South Africa would not retain their positions if they had to account for large numbers of white casualties. During the East Africa campaign, and also to some extent in Southwest Africa, men were coerced into service. This has become the dominant perception of how the Carrier Corps came to be. I don't dispute this. But there is evidence to show the full story. Many young men, particularly in the early days, chose to serve for the same reasons many white men did: adventure, change, and easy money. Interviews by Gerald Rilling and Miles Osborne, as well as research by Michelle Moyd, support this. Chiefs in South Africa, loyal to the sovereign, but not the Union, purposefully sent their sons to serve so that they, the chiefs, could get first-hand information and before they sent out others. A recent discovery in South Africa by myself and others has led to the finding of attestation, death and discharge papers for the South African and East African Labour Corps. From these, it is clear that some personal servants, generally in those days called boys, served with the same officer in 4 theatres of war. This could not be by force. The discovery of these records in the South African military archives provides a rich source of new information on those who served as labourers. The details recording the next of kin, illnesses, ships they sailed on, special duties undertaken, and the reason for leaving the service, as well as outstanding pay and pension. And this builds brilliantly on the work already done by Albert Grundling. So far, I haven't found a comparable document for the white forces. Black labour in South Africa was undertaken by the Department of Native Affairs rather than the military, so they kept their own records. The Prime Minister Louis Botha, who was head of this department too, had a paternalistic attitude towards the majority of South Africa's inhabitants, knowing that questions would be asked by family members and being aware of the need to keep black unhappiness out of the public arena to prevent the Nationalist Party from gaining political ground. Having detailed records and information about each labourer would help manage any questions or challenges which arose. Included in this recent discovery were desertion records. If men were not happy, they deserted from all forces. Despite the German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck claiming that his men remained loyal, Michelle Moyd estimates that about a third deserted, including his personal cook. Other evidence to support desertion includes propaganda pictures of men hanging from trees for deserting and the threats of death to those who were caught. Norman Jewell, a doctor who served with the British forces for most of the campaign, in charge of the 3rd East African Field Ambulance, specifically responsible for black soldiers and carriers, noted in his diaries kept at the National Archives, the men who went AWOL without leave received lashes. It is worth noting that it is only from 1917 onwards that these lashings appear in his records. And this accords with the introduction of conscription of both black and white in East Africa and the resultant change in fighting tactics. The publication of Jules' memoirs, including the discovery of his official diary accounts, has been an eye-opener. The general perception had been that black carriers were left by the side of the road to die. Jules' memoir indicates otherwise, although there were by no means enough field ambulances or medical services in general, as noted by the hard-hitting Pike report. Research being undertaken by a senior academic at Queen Mary's University in London into the Commonwealth war graves practices in Africa suggests that carriers were generally buried in unmarked mass graves, unless it could be proven or verified that the individual was a Christian, Jew, or Muslim. Only religious men were buried in Commonwealth war graves, or Sikh, were buried in Commonwealth war graves. Similarly, where men died on the march, they were buried, if for no other reason than health. Identifying where these burials were is a challenge. Wooden markers disintegrate, stones get moved, locations are misrecorded in the heat of the moment. Supporting evidence where it is possible the dead were dealt with, supporting evidence that where possible the dead were dealt with, again comes from Jules' comments, that they would burn animal carcasses, horse and cattle killed by sleeping sickness, to stop the spread of disease. And if they were going to do that for animals, they would do it more so for men. This would be done a mile from camp. And if you've ever driven past an abattoir, you'll recognize the stench, that of death and decay, often reported in the diaries of the campaign. The East African campaign was one of endurance for all, irrespective of race, creed, role, age, or gender. I haven't touched on the role of women in the theatre. There is little mention of them found in literature. However, we know some served as nurses in the base hospitals. The German women, black and white, were often camp followers, and many undertook farming activities. Photos of the East Africa campaign in particular show that women were engaged in supplying the forces, such as in the Lake Tanganyika expedition. And Norman Jewell writes of Nandi women training as nurses. Children were born on the march, and those old enough did their part in helping carry and undertake whatever tasks needed doing, as Michelle Moyd has explained. Finally, the years of war took their toll. Uniforms were scrounged from wherever they could be. Men died while others survived. Leto Forbach fought for his men to be paid for their wartime services, something that happened after he died. A white woman, Jane Tame in Dar es Salaam, administered the payments until the last veteran died in late 2000s. The remnants of war, documents, photos, cemetery and landscape hold clues to what happened. We just need to let them speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much.